And now we're going to start our routes. Route 1 will be a special session on strategic partnerships for PPPs and infrastructure in Latin America and the Caribbean, moderated by Gaston Stesiana, leader of the PPP team at the IDB. Route 2 will be recycling assets, key elements for the valuation and monetization of infrastructure assets with Federico Villalobos, infrastructure partner at Deloitte, and Eduardo de la Peña, infrastructure partner for Latin America in Spanish at Deloitte. Have a great panel, everyone. You may start.
Good morning. It is an honor to share with you such an important theme, considering our reality today. We have, as the rest of the world, a very complex situation. We had to face it, still with the same infrastructure that we've had for many years. Now, we can show a model of asset recycling. And another thing would be the application of the PPPs for new energy models and activities associated to the new trends with regards to clean energy development. First, I would like then to show my screen. With regards to recycling assets, it is important to ask ourselves a question. We are a region that, as I said before, in the region we have a lot of room to improvement, and according to several studies published recently by the Development Bank. Now, we also have this whole gap of lack of investment, so we have to cover for that. But how do we articulate the development of certain sectors, and how we do create this articulation? We are not talking about only transportation. We're talking about, for example, transport connected to information technology. How can we link them? How can we unite technologies, for example, to solid waste treatment? So how can we create an interrelationship, and how can convert those statements into a infrastructure network? How can we transform that? So get it out from the talk to reality. Those infrastructure projects have a very long life cycle, require a lot of investment. So to move from ideas to projects, they have to meet some needs and some goals that had been established initially. So starting from the need for investment, as we mentioned before, and also the need for that kind of connection in the infrastructure. And how can we prepare the projects? We have to ask ourselves what we are doing, how we've done traditionally in Latin America. This is where we ask this question. Do we build things to forget about them? We develop public things based on quality. So what kind of orientation we use? What kind of guidance do we use? It is important to think over the following. How do we develop roads? I talk about roads just to give you an example of something that it is simple and easy to understand, so that we can give justification to the model. But that, of course, could be repeated in other sectors. We prepare a project, we prepare certain occasions. We know that we move away a little bit from the norm, but we have some, say, delays in the plan. We go over cost. what happens? We inaugurate the project, and there is the deterioration soon after. And what happens next? We have to intervene. We have to we run into more costs. So there is this dynamic, and then the whole impact, the positive impact that it would have to the society is actually offset by a drop in the quality of services, and at the same time, because of the fiscal additional cost, and it takes, um, you know, it's obvious to the citizens that those costs are inherited by the government. So we start from a scheme that where we work to develop a project, thinking not in the development of the project for a long time, but exclusively in their construction part. And all we do, we inaugurate a project, to bring a project to life, and after that moment, this is when the deterioration starts. This is basically our rule that we have at the region, how we manage those infrastructures, and we know that there is a potential to uh, to have discipline, to manage projects, infrastructure projects. We should. How can we find a balance when we are developing some sort of public structure? Well, we have to consider if the project is linked or articulated with long term, and is there any articulation with the rest of the network? Is there sort of service focus? We look more into to the cars, or to the time that the project will be used, and so there is this, once again, that is a vision of this network, or the infrastructural network. Is it part of a whole, or it is just isolated? We have to have discipline, and the maintenance is also important. Maybe that's not the case. We build, and then we live in those very short-term cycles, and the project goes into deterioration, and then we have to have another project. So perhaps it is possible to monetize the whole infrastructure that was being developed, and it is important to remember all we see around. Aqueducts, roads, airports, those are financial resources from the contributor, from the users. Things that money that is turned into concrete and steel, and into a public work. But we have two ways: deterioration, which is the traditional short-term way, or we have the way of monetizing and restructuring those projects. How do we do that? This is where we now talk about the optimization of assets, or recycling the assets. This is not a new model in the world. However, it is relatively new in our Latin American region. There are some benefits, and I want to talk about them. Australia has done that. They were pioneering in developing recycling assets, more than $30 million projects. So that means to change a project into new resources with more than $30 million, and they go into like a circle, and to create more revenue and to give continuity to the project. As I said, there is a very complex fiscal structure because of the pandemic. Countries after pandemic felt this pressure on their finances, and there are a lot of restrictions how they are going to develop their structures, their infrastructure. And the International Monetary Fund ran an analysis for about 30 countries. The average of the infrastructure of a country was established at 60%, of beyond 60%, 65% of the revenue. the gross revenue of the country. So we can monetize. It's not that we can monetize 65% of the projects. No, but what I'm saying is that there is some riches that we are not using. The riches that we have in the infrastructure that we're not using. So this is why we suggest recycling assets and monetization. What is it? What is it then? What is recycling assets? What is the asset recycling? The state has, say, a road or a port or some railroads. They already have the asset. That has a value. What do they do? They allow a scheme to monetize that asset. So how? The private investor acknowledges or gives a initial payment. Of course, we have to consider what the elements allow us to establish that amount, the initial amount. So they acknowledge the needs. So they something that has been developed before. So the private sector goes and pays for that, and after they take on the responsibility of maintenance and the management of that asset. So we achieve very important things. What? We protect the value, the asset value. Otherwise, it would be deteriorated, as I said before. It goes into that cycle of deterioration. At the same time, we have new resources that can kind of trigger other projects that are highly needed for the country. For example, we have a road. We can monetize the same route, so to guarantee that there is a maintenance, and we can invest the resources that are a result of that monetization in other projects, such as clinics, schools, aqueducts, and some other infrastructure. So it is important when we're talking about asset optimization to already orient the use of that money for the regeneration of the infrastructure projects. So in a way to generate resources to other public work. So basically, the revenue is dedicated to other projects. So what we want is to collaborate in the development and the development of this law in Costa Rica, in which we incorporated now this asset recycling, and it is already incorporated in our Costa Rican law. So basically, resources are to be reinvested so that we generate some sort of trust within the community according to the needs of for infrastructure in the community. How do we apply that model? It is basically it's in this public-private combination. I want to give you details, but this is like PPP, and it is important to remember this is not a privatization. We're talking about a cession, and we're talking about the property of the public asset, the possession of a public asset, but it's basically the management of a public resource, and also where each player operates. The state is always the owner of the asset, and the company that comes in as an expert in that type of infrastructure, and they bring in more risk capital. And we also have the banks. The financing aspect comes in also with in a passive way with resources in long term. Fine. When we say financiers, as a matter of fact, this is a scheme with their presence. It gives us more flexibility, such as the presence of pension funds. So all those schemes and other instruments that are going to be used to manage the cash flow of the project. What are then the two sides of this coin? On this side, you have the perspective from the concessionaire. They will bring in resources, additional resources, and then of course they have to accept the maintenance operation. At the same time, they will recover by means of investing money and recovering tariffs. I would like to make a comment, a very brief comment. In addition to a very interesting part of this scheme that I suggested, there are many countries that depend in this kind of resources that are, for example, leveraged with the taxes levied to fuel and or to the technological changes. So those are instruments that are brought to the table as forms of replacing those type of tariffs. So in like it's 20 years, of course, there will be a change, and that money won't be the same as the money that the state receives. But of course, we can invest in new projects. So this is why we have this cycle. We are allowed to invest in new projects and at the same time use this asset recycling scheme. But of course, that depends on the amount of money. Is it either less or more? But of course, in this combination of private public sector, there are several elements. One, the macroeconomy of the country. What is happening? How stable is the institution? Of course, this is something that we discuss all the time. It has to do with the institutional capabilities, and the third, the asset, the conditions of the asset, and how much investment they need. It is very important to consider this because the companies or the countries are creating several different types of work, and it is important. If you think of asset recycling, you have to do it parallel to the moment in which you are developing the asset, so that you can consider time. You have already a knowledge of time. So some assets take like 5-6 years, and the value ends up not being the same, and then there might be too much deterioration during this time. And of course, the term of the agreement and the tariffs that apply to the user. This is very important. Visibility, and of course the behavior of the man to the future. Elements that are variable, actually. They makes thing go up and down with regards to the value that is received by the state, based on this concept. The asset value uh, by the lifetime. When is it an optimum moment to be able to use that amount of or that figure? Say that a project has already some life, some time, and there is then based on that you can launch it to the market at that value. But of course, there must be some sort of years of history so that investors might get some sort of information, not only based on the studies, but also the performance of that specific asset. One of the key points is the following. Asset recycling allows many countries that have had this kind of barrier in incorporating pension funds or to infrastructure projects. So a lot is being discussed, and we analyze the resources that come from pension funds, and this happens. Why? Because we expect that to be invested during the construction, but that kind of risk is not, for example, incorporated in their portfolio. Well, this asset recycling perspective brings a very important condition, not only to all those objectives that I mentioned, but also to be able to generate a way to save money locally. Sometimes that money is being invested exclusively in government bonds, as because of the lack of alternative. But at least this could give more possibility to the investors with a wider vision of a public-private agreement. Just to finalize my ideas, I would like to mention here what is still pending in the region for us to be able to apply these ideas. One would be the financing. As I said, the traditional resources for funding some sort of structure project, we would have the goal to what? Go from one sector to the other. In the case of the transportation or road construction sector, we can move, for example, link the payment to the results. So kind of move away from that scheme, which is just based on fuel tax, fuel tariffs, to be able to generate some money, and the payment made for the use of certain road, for example. And for asset management, of course, we're talking about a model that must be incorporated in this scheme, and you have to count on a public asset management scheme. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense to apply this type of idea. So we have to have some programs to manage our assets, to generate quality services, and last but not least, it is a long-term vision. In other words, how to get away from that electoral cycle. So, it happens to all of our countries. It's like after 3 years, and then they have the scheme, they have a project, all of a sudden the politics change, and the politicians change, and everything changes. So we have to have a policy so that the projects keep going no matter what, or no matter the election results. So we can move from what I said at the beginning to establish, to develop things, and to go to move to a scheme of service with quality, and the public sector, private sector money coming in grants more competitivity and better results to all citizens. Thank you very much, and I'd like to pass the floor to my partner there. Thank you. Now, on the same line, with these schemes in which we can use our resources in a more efficient way, I would like to introduce you to a very interesting case, and that could be replicated all through Latin America. Just to use, for example, the subsidies from the electrical bill as a source of payment. This is something that we did in Mexico. I would like to just introduce to you, and this could be used in all Latin America. For some reason my remote control is not working. Can you guys help me? Can you help me, please? The remote is not working. I cannot change my... In this case... Oh, it's working. And as a matter of fact, the utility subsidies, electricity bill, was canalized as a source of payment. 38.5 million users receive electrical subsidies, and the most important thing is that increases yearly. So what I'm saying, every 5 years, it duplicates, it twice-fold. So we have then a program so that there are solar panels throughout, in the cities. So instead of increasing those subsidies, now they will stop, and at the very initial stage, we have 5.5 million homes, 2 gigawatts of electricity distributed. This will go to 20 to 30 gigawatts. So this could be used in any Latin American country. This is very quick, just for you to understand what we were talking before, what Fede was talking about. And 30% of our electricity generated in Mexico go to homes. 38 million users. This is what we're talking about. If you compare to other countries in Latin America, as we say, it is very similar. Many of the users here, most of them are home users, and these are the second consumer. Out of those, in the case of Mexico, 98%, they receive subsidies. And that also is the reality of the rest of the continent. What happens to the subsidies? Well, at least in Mexico, and actually there is a very interesting study from BID that talks about, or that analyzes electric subsidies in El Salvador, Brazil, Argentina, several places. It goes from this growth. It goes from 25%. So basically, for 2024 in Mexico, in terms of subsidies, we're going to have provided $6 billion every year in subsidies, instead of using that in productive activities. So just to give you an idea, This is basically more money in subsidies, in electricity subsidies, than what it is designed to social programs to the youth or to disabled people. We're just spending our money into just providing electric subsidies. So that is the scheme. Well, anyhow, instead of having an utility company, basically Mexico is SFE, and they provide electricity to the homes. And then what we do is create, by means of an APP contract, this company goes, sets up a solar panel, and the part of their payment is basically the future subsidy that is put into trust. So instead of making the state responsible for spending the money to charge and then to set up the panels, they give that to the private sector, and that is canalized. What we're saying is that this pilot project is very small. Here we're talking about 1.5 million users. So this is 0.4% of our electricity measure. This is nothing. But we went around and we studied a lot. So what we were saying before, initial projects for 5 million users, and then we're going to move to 2 giga. But then it can go up to 25 or 30 giga capacity, installed capacity. So what we did was to have all those users, all home users in the circle, and we make it shorter or smaller, and we need those that can some sort of have enough rooftop that can hold the panels. And for those who don't have solar panels, we kind of remove those that somehow would need a rehab, and remove those that had their own homes, and then those who had credit history. So this is the yellow circle. So this would be 1.5%. So this is the process of selection of users that could be enrolled to the program. And then you can see that each of the homes, more or less, and we did that with several variables, and then we did that to the roof. We have $1,300 per home to be able to set up a panel. So this is the program designed for the implementation in 5 years. Interesting. When we talk about 1.2 giga, you are actually creating an industry, and then it can go to 30, as I said. But the problem that we had in Mexico is that we had to analyze the situation in each country, but there were not enough companies to set up all those many panels. So that program would just kind of get out of our hands. We had to create small companies and train people. Why? Because we didn't count on enough people to start with the program. We started and then in 3 or 4 years, 4 giga was installed. But then we were going to build, if we had technical capacity. What basically do is that they receive fixed payment by number of users, and then of course you have some KPIs, and then they can update the figure. But this is the orange line, so it grows as much as. And that light green is the subsidy that is released. And as time goes, you have more subsidies. Remember what we said? So it's approximately $5 to $6 billion in subsidies every year. And if you run this program, it would be money that can be reinvested in new infrastructure. So what can we do with $5 billion yearly in terms of subsidies? To bring it back to the infrastructure, to the country. Well, very interesting. How to finance this type of project. So the subsidy is representing 57% of the revenue that is needed for the project. And the users, the people, pay for what? For the rent. They would have the benefit. Why? Instead of paying for a tariff that varies on a monthly basis, they pay for a certain amount of consumption or a certain amount of electricity, and there is a 20% discount. So a benefit to the user because there is a discount, and so Then they bring the panel, and then you say, well, you're gonna pay 20%, and there will be some sort of fixed payment, and then you get your panel. This is the 30%. After that, you calculate the exceeding value. Why? Because the form that we generate the electricity on the distribution is different, of course, to the consumption curve. So when the people are not consuming electricity is when this you have the excess, and that goes back to the grid to a very at a very conservative price, and that would generate even 4 or 5% of additional revenue. And also there is the clean energy certificates or carbon credit in other countries. This is what it is called. That is about 7%. So the whole thing is actually channeled to as a source of revenue, and is linked to the subsidy. So there are several benefits. One, you save energy. The utility does not have to set more lines, transmission lines, so you're spending less money, and because of the tariffs that are very deficitary compared to what they charge from the user. And you also have other economic benefits because there are a lot of resources and there is demand. I'm talking about not having money, but there's some money that is spent in subsidies. So let us use that money intelligently. So rechannel that into solar panels, with environmental benefits. So in each country that has this subsidy in electricity or in the utility companies, they should do this. I would invite you to talk more about this in detail. So wherever you have subsidies in the electricity bill, you can just change the way you operate to generate new projects. And I think it is a very simple idea. It's just basically how to use the money wisely. Time or crisis, just imagination is the most important thing, that intelligence. So this is a moment of crisis, so we have to use that kind of asset recycling, which is to rechannel the use of your subsidies to create more investment in the sector. Thank you.